for this first session of Net Zero Week. We've just launched on YouTube, but this is our first session with people attending in the room, as it were, and we're delighted to be doing so. Like I say, just for anybody that's just joined, if you could go on mute, that would be really, really helpful. And I'm delighted that today we've got joining us Lucy Heath, Chief Reporter at Inside Housing. This is going to be a fast session. Lucy is going to take us through some key facts, some background to this whole agenda. It's meant to be a session that will leave us with a series of slides that you can look at your leisure. We will record this session, unless anybody's got any objections. We want to record it so that we can keep playing it out all week for anybody else that wants to, that hasn't been able to come here this morning and join this session. There will be a limited opportunity for a few questions at the end, but this really is meant to be a session where Lucy takes us through, and then the opportunities will evolve over the course of the whole week at all the other sessions that we've got running. So you'll be able to think about those and then ask some of those questions from the issues Lucy's raised. But we will try and get to a few questions at the end if we can. But we do need to finish by about 10 to 11, so we can also then start the next session. It's fast paced. I'm sorry, it's just the way it is this morning, people. We're all go. So without further ado, enough of me. I am going to hand you over now to Lucy Heath. Thank you, Lucy.
All right, thanks very much, Jenny. I am just going to share my screen because I have a little slideshow to show. Okay, is that working? I'm sure someone will jump in and tell me if it's not working. Well, let me just.
Yes, it's fine.
Okay,
looking good.
All right, great. All right, well, yeah, so like Jenny says, my name's Lucy. I am the Chief Reporter at Inside Housing, and I'm really pleased to be here today to talk to all of you about this really important topic. So I've been asked to offer a bit of an introduction into net zero and what it means for our housing, and I'm really going to bring it down to the basics. So apologies if some of you already know some of this stuff that I'm going to tell you, but I feel like we hear the words kind of net zero and climate change thrown about all the time in the news right now, but so many of us don't really know exactly what those words mean. So I'm going to talk for about 25 minutes today, and I'm going to first walk you through what climate change means, what's causing it. Then I'm going to talk about how our housing impacts climate change, what we're going to have to do to our homes in order to achieve net zero. And finally, then I'm going to talk a little bit about what the government and social landlords are currently doing when it comes to achieving net zero in our housing. Okay, so what is climate change? In its most simple terms, climate change is a shift in the average weather of a place over time. It's now widely accepted that Earth is experiencing a period of rapid climate change with global temperatures rising over time. This is essentially being caused by the fact that there's more greenhouse gas in the air than there used to be. And greenhouse gases are gases that trap the sun's heat. And while these gases are essential for keeping our planet at a suitable temperature, the amount of greenhouse gas in our atmosphere has increased over the last century or so, which is causing our planet to get warmer. So why are there more greenhouse gases in the air? This is primarily driven by human activity. And this is driven by the growth of one greenhouse gas in particular, which is carbon dioxide. So over 100 years ago now, humans began burning fossil fuels, so primarily oil, gas, and coal, to power factories and transport and to heat our homes. At the same time, there has also been massive deforestation, which also drives up carbon dioxide emissions as trees store carbon, and when they're chopped down, that carbon is released into the air. So the amount of carbon dioxide in the air has risen about 50% since the 19th century and about 12% in the last 2 decades alone. So what is going to happen to our planet? A lot of you might have heard of the Paris Climate Agreement, which is an international treaty that was signed on climate change in 2015. And it has the goal of limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees and ideally 1.5 degrees from pre-industrial levels. So that's kind of the period of 1850 to 1900. And there's kind of a general agreement that 1.5 degrees is kind of like a safe level above which temperatures should not rise. So currently the Earth is about 1.1 degrees warmer than pre-industrial levels, which is illustrated nicely on this graph that I've stolen from The Guardian. Last month, you might have saw a report came out from the International Panel on Climate Change, known as the IPCC, and that predicted that we will meet this 1.5 degree limit within the next 20 years. And this report, which was kind of like 8 years in the making, and it really represents kind of the world's knowledge on this issue to date, predicts that some of the long-term impacts of climate change are already inevitable and irreversible, such as rising sea levels. But it did say that drastic reductions in our carbon emissions could stave off the worst effects of climate change. So this essentially means that we are looking at a future of more extreme weather conditions than we are used to, whether that's kind of major droughts in places like Africa or Australia, or extreme flooding and rainfall in places like the UK. But we still do have some ability to control how kind of extreme and drastic that weather gets. Okay, so how do we stop this? In order to stop global warming, we have to dramatically reduce the amount of carbon dioxide that we are putting into the air. And this is where the concept of net zero comes in. So you've probably heard that countries across the world are setting targets for when they're going to reach net zero. The UK was actually the first major economy to legislate a target, and the UK government has set a target that we will be net zero by 2050. Put simply, net zero refers to the balance between the amount of greenhouse gas being produced and put into the air and the amount that is removed from the atmosphere. So a country reaches net zero when it's putting no more carbon dioxide into the air than it is taken out. So while there are ways to increase the amount of carbon dioxide that you take out of the air, for example, by planting more trees or using technology that captures carbon, primarily we as a society are going to have to dramatically reduce the amount of carbon dioxide we put into the air in order to achieve net zero. So how does housing come into this? So housing is one of the leading causes of CO2 emissions on the planet. This is primarily because of the energy we use to heat our homes and to get hot water. So a 2019 report from the Committee on Climate Change, which is an independent body that advises the UK government, found that energy used to heat our homes accounts for 14% of the UK's total CO2 emissions, and that the UK will not meet its 2050 target without the near complete elimination of greenhouse gases from our buildings. So how are we going to reduce the emissions from our houses? There are currently about 29 million homes in the UK, and most of these homes are going to have to be retrofitted in some way if the country is going to hit its net zero target. What gets done to your home will depend a lot on what type of home it is and what kind of heating source you have. But I'm just going to run through some of the things that we will have to do to our homes in order to get them to net zero. So you'll often hear kind of landlords and other people say that they take a fabric first approach to retrofitting, which means you first focus on improving insulation, air tightness, and ventilation to ensure people don't need to use their heating as much in the first place. So doing this will include things like installing insulation in the walls or loft, and installing triple glazing, and making sure that no draft comes in from doors, and yeah, other things like that. So this is a kind of work that homeowners and landlords can really get on with doing right now, as we know for certain that this work will have to be done in order to hit net zero. However, this will only go so far, and it is likely at some point the heating system and all of our homes are going to have to be changed. So the vast majority of us, about 85% of us, live in homes that are connected to the gas grid and use gas boilers to keep our homes warm. Burning gas produces carbon dioxide, so we won't be able to keep heating our homes in this way if the UK is to hit net zero. Plus, the remaining 15% of homes that are off-grid tend to use either oil or liquid petroleum gas or electric heating to heat their homes. And these off-grid homes tend to be even more carbon intensive than those that are connected to the grid. And the Committee on Climate Change has found that currently only about 1 million homes in the UK, which is 3% have a low carbon heating source. So the majority of homes in the UK are going to have their heating source changed to a low carbon source. There are a few different options that are currently being considered when it comes to low carbon heating systems, and government, scientists and landlords are still going through the process of evaluating what types of systems will work best for different housing types and different geographical areas, etc. So this is in no way an exhaustive list, but I'm going to run through some of the main systems and technologies that I think you will hear people talking about this week to explain a little bit more about what they are and how they work. So heat pumps. Heat pumps are probably the main feasible option being considered for low carbon heating right now. Heat pumps is the name given to a group of technologies that effectively pump heat from one place to another. So the main types of heat pumps you'll hear about are air source heat pumps and ground source heat pumps. Air source heat pumps absorb heat from outside to provide heating and hot water within your home, and they can extract heat from temperatures as low as -15 degrees. Ground source heat pumps are very similar, but they extract heat from the ground instead of the air, meaning you usually need quite a big garden for this option. So heat pumps need electricity to run, but because they're extracting renewable heat from the environment, the heat output is greater than the electricity input, which means that they are a very energy efficient option. Heat pumps are definitely going to play a major role in the government strategy moving towards net zero. Earlier this year, Boris Johnson published a 10-point plan to tackle climate change, and this included the aim that the UK should be installing 600,000 heat pumps per year by 2028. So the benefits of heat pumps are huge and should theoretically also lead to a reduction in your heating bills. However, one of the main challenges at the moment is that there just isn't a big industry built up around heat pumps like there is around gas boilers. So they can still be quite expensive to install, and it can sometimes be hard to find the people who have the expertise to do a good job of this at the moment. Heat networks. So heat networks are also sometimes called district heating, and they're kind of another thing that I want to briefly talk to you about. Unlike heat pumps, heat networks aren't really a technology, but they are more a system that transfers heat from a central source somewhere, often known as an energy center, to individual buildings and homes via pipes. So this is different to a gas boiler system where heat is generated within each individual person's home, which is clearly much less efficient than having a central place where we generate heat and then transport the heat. Heat networks are not new. They've actually existed for more than 100 years and are quite popular in other parts of Europe, for example. But right now in the UK, currently only about 500,000 homes are connected to heat networks. Heat networks can be powered in any number of ways, and so they aren't inherently low carbon. And actually, the majority of heat networks in the UK are currently powered by gas. However, one of the major benefits to creating heat networks right now is that even if they do use gas, it's much easier to change the heating source of one central plant than having to go into each individual home and replace a gas boiler. And there are lots of potential low carbon options for powering heat networks that are being explored as an alternative to gas. This, of course, can include using heat pumps, but also things like using heat from waste plants or geothermal sources. And there's even a heat network that was recently installed in Islington in London, which is the picture on the slide. And that uses heat from the London Underground, and that heats social housing. I think it also heats a number of schools. So that's quite an exciting project. Like heat pumps, heat networks will definitely play a huge role in the government's transition towards net zero, with the Committee on Climate Change estimating that 18% of the UK's heat supply will need to come from networks if the country is to reach net zero by 2050. Okay, hydrogen. The final heating option I will briefly mention is hydrogen. The UK government and scientists across the world are currently putting a lot of effort into researching the potential of hydrogen, as unlike natural gas, it produces no carbon at the point of use. In some respects, switching to hydrogen could be much more straightforward than the other technologies I've mentioned, as some hope that it would be possible to convert the entire gas grid to hydrogen, therefore meaning we could use all of our existing infrastructure. However, definitely worth stressing that work in this area is still quite in its infancy, and there are some major barriers to using hydrogen, including the cost of producing hydrogen at the kind of scale that would be needed to meet the UK's energy needs. So before I move on, I'll just quickly say a word on electricity, as I have mainly been talking about gas heating and the impact that is having on climate change. Earlier on, I quoted a figure from the Committee on Climate Change that said heating our homes accounts for 14% of the UK's total CO2 emissions. This figure doesn't include the electricity use in our home, and that accounts for a further 4% of the country's greenhouse gas emissions. So homes in the UK receive their electricity from the national grid, and some fairly significant progress has already been made in the UK when it comes to decarbonising the grid. And the power sector has actually managed to halve its emissions between 2012 and 2017 alone. This has largely been driven by a move away from coal, and an increase in the use of renewable energy such as wind and solar power, combined with the improved energy efficiency of electrical products. So while that's really positive, the further rapid decarbonisation of electricity is going to be really important, especially as we're planning to rely on electricity for other carbon intensive processes, such as heating our homes using heat pumps, but also, you know, like driving electrical vehicles and stuff. Okay. So there's a lot of technology out there, and we know, at least to a certain extent, what we're going to have to do to decarbonise our homes. But obviously, none of this is going to happen without the support of the government, both in terms of strategic direction, but also in terms of funding, because this work can be very expensive. Before I get into what the government's policy in this area has been, I think it'd be useful to quickly explain to you how we measure the energy efficiency of homes, because I think this week you will hear people using phrases like SAP ratings and EPC ratings a lot, and it's really helpful to understand what these phrases mean in order to understand the policies and the targets that people are talking about. So the government has a methodology called the Standard Assessment Procedure, known as SAP, in order to measure the energy and environmental performance of a home. And basically this methodology provides a home with a score that is typically between 1 and 100, based on how much energy a home must consume in order to kind of reach a defined level of comfort, with 1 being the worst and 100 meaning the home has 0 energy cost. Once a SAP rating has been calculated, it will be used to form the Energy Performance Certificate, or EPC, of a building, with all buildings having an EPC rating between A and F, with A being the best. And you can kind of see on this slide how your kind of SAP number correlates with your EPC rating. So while these measures are not perfect, and plenty of people who know a lot more about it than me definitely have criticisms of this system, they are currently being used a lot at the moment by both the government and social landlords when it comes to developing their net zero strategies. So it's definitely worth knowing kind of what they are and roughly what they mean. So yeah, what has the government been doing so far to help decarbonise our homes? In terms of strategy, everyone is kind of eagerly waiting for the government's heat and building strategy, which it said will create a bit more of a roadmap towards 2050 in terms of the heat being produced by our buildings. This strategy has been repeatedly delayed, but ministers have promised that we should expect this strategy imminently. So who knows, maybe we'll even get it this week, we'll see. The government has been a bit more clear in terms of its plans for new build housing, as it has released the Future Home Standard, which will come into force in 2025. And after this date, all new homes must meet this standard. The most significant thing in there is that no new homes built after 2025 will be allowed to have gas boilers installed. So it's expected that new builds will probably mostly use heat pumps after this date. In terms of funding, various governments have introduced various schemes over the past decade or two, but I think it's fair to say that to date, there's been kind of no overarching funding scheme that has really taken off when it comes to the retrofitting of housing. In terms of this government, you may have heard of the Green Homes Grant that was introduced in July last year, which has been their largest attempt so far to tackle the issue. When it was announced, the scheme was worth £2 billion, 1.5 billion of which was to be given to homeowners as vouchers in order to carry out upgrades in their homes. And the other 500 million was given to local authorities to carry out retrofits within low-income households. However, the homeowner part of the scheme was quite broadly viewed as a bit of a disaster. It was scrapped in March this year, and the government reached less than 10% of the homes that it planned to. The local authority part of the scheme is still ongoing and does seem to be doing a bit better. However, it has been hit with some of the same problems of the homeowner scheme, such as just difficulty accessing a kind of developed supply chain and also a kind of poor central planning from the government. In terms of social housing, which I guess is really what we're here to talk about today, the government has set a target that all social homes should have a minimum EPC rating of C by 2035, and that this should be achieved by 2030 for fuel poor households. In order to help the sector decarbonise, the government's 2019 election manifesto promised a social housing decarbonisation fund, which it said will be worth 3.8 billion over 10 years. In 2020, the government released a small 50 million fund in order to pay for demonstrator projects that it said would shape how the larger fund is developed. Then this year, it released a further 160 million of funding, which it is calling Wave 1 of the fund. And this funding is really focused on the worst performing social homes, bringing them up to a minimum EPC rating of C. However, social landlords are really desperate for the government to release more of this funding, especially over a longer time period, so that they can begin really tackling the issue at scale. So this brings me on finally to what social landlords are currently doing. In kind of a broad general, social landlords are probably currently in the process of developing their decarbonisation strategies, which will generally involve evaluating the energy efficiency of all of their housing stock and coming up with plans that lay out, which homes they need to tackle, in what order, and what technology they are looking to install in order to improve their energy efficiency. Last year, I published a piece of research that looked into the decarbonisation plans of social landlords that was based on survey responses from 207 councils and housing associations. So to finish off, I'll just quickly run you through some of my main findings from this. Firstly, I found that 81% of social landlords were able to provide an average SAP rating of their housing stock, which essentially means that 1 in 5 social landlords are still at that kind of early stage of working out what their baseline is. Of those who could provide an average SAP rating, I found that the average rating of the sector was 70.1, which is actually not too bad, as recent government figures found the average SAP rating for all housing stock across England was 63, which is much lower. And in general, social homes do tend to be slightly more energy efficient than the private rented sector, for example. The next thing I asked landlords was what kind of target they are looking at when it comes to achieving net zero. While most social landlords, especially housing associations, are looking towards 2050 as their target for net zero, some social landlords, mostly councils, have set earlier targets. And you may have heard some councils have declared climate emergencies and are trying to hit a kind of 2030 target for net zero. So 20% of the landlords who responded to my survey had set a net zero target earlier than 2050. This included 31 councils who will be aiming to hit net zero by 2030. The final thing in my research that I'll highlight is how much social landlords are expecting to spend on decarbonisation over the coming years. So my research found that social landlords expect it to cost an average of £20,742 per home in order to retrofit it to a net zero standard, meaning that this could cost the sector a total of 104 billion over the next 30 years. So it's definitely expected that this number will change, especially as technology becomes cheaper, as it is more widely used. However, there's no denying that this work is going to take up a huge amount of social landlords' times and budgets over the next decades. There are lots of ways landlords will be looking to meet these costs, including government grant, but it's clear that a lot more work has to be done to figure out how the social housing sector is going to decarbonise. I've been talking for a while now, so I am going to leave it there so we've got time for some questions, but I hope that was really informative and happy to answer any questions that you have.
Wow, thank you, Lucy. What a fantastic romp through that was. I don't know about everyone else, but I learned a lot there, the things I didn't know either. So yeah, brilliant, really good. And just to assure everybody again, while Lucy just stopped sharing her screen for us, just to kind of assure everybody that we are being recorded, this will be available, so you'll be able to look back at that. There was a lot of information, wasn't there, so you'll be able to do that over leisure over the course of the week. There's a few questions in the chat. I'm going to make sure that Lucy's not feeling she's got to answer all of these and that she's not an expert in all of this, but I do think there's a couple of things in there that are probably quite useful for us to pick up on. Just firstly though, Alan, you mentioned in the chat about whether there was going to be a graph on other countries' CO2 emissions, just to see that in the context of not just UK alone. We can do that. We can look for that over the course of this week, Alan. So I will sort that out and we can share that to people, and people that have booked on today, I'll get that and share it out. I think let's get to one that everyone's going to be asking this week. Lucy, your view on Sally Truman asks, how much will the rents have to go up to fund this? I wonder. I suspect, like I said, this question will come a lot. Let's get it out there now. What's your thoughts on that, or what you're hearing?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and it's a bit of a controversial one from, when I speak to people working for social landlords about this question all the time. So there is a thing called, people kind of call it warm rents. It's a concept that's out there that is essentially, if a landlord can improve the energy efficiency of your home, so for example, install all of this insulation, for example, in order to reduce your heating bills, then some people believe they should be able to kind of charge more rent because of the reduction in your heating bills. That's definitely an idea that some have thrown around. Some people are supportive of that idea as a way to pay for this work, but I've also spoken to some people that are not supportive of this idea. And I think obviously one of the major challenges there will be to really prove that you have reduced someone's heating bills, because you can do this work in especially at the moment while these technologies are in their infancy and haven't been widely used. You don't always get those heating bill reductions that you would assume. So yeah, my answer is definitely possible. It's definitely something that's been talked about, but on the other hand, I've definitely spoken to landlords who are not supportive of this idea.
Okay, thank you, Lucy. And again, I just want to assure people a lot of these questions will come up and be answered over the course of the week. Let's see if you can have a go at a couple of these. An interesting one from Joseph here about, if you just read it out for anyone that can't see the chat. RHA uses air source, but they are changing some of them with ground source due to the salt air, due to being close to the sea, which means the pumps are decaying due to rust. And I just wondered whether you'd heard that at all, Lucy, but I think the other point as well, and for answering that, but is this idea of some things are happening already, aren't they? And we're learning lessons fast already about what's working and what's not. So you could talk to that point as well, if you can.
Yeah, sure. So I haven't heard of that specific example, but one thing I'll say is, yeah, so much of this work is already happening, usually in kind of pilot trial phases. So a lot of landlords are doing kind of small pilots, especially with heat pumps. Heat networks are starting to be used a bit more widely. And, it's inevitable that things won't work perfectly, and everything won't be, perfect right away. And I think it's a really tricky one, and it's one that I struggle with in my reporting, because I do report on sustainability, and I have written about the problems with heat networks, for example. So people who have been connected to heat networks have reported issues, including like more frequent outages, high bills. And what I found in that work, and I think it's very similar to people who've reported problems with heat pumps, is that the root of the problem is usually the lack of expertise and kind of poor construction practices. So there aren't a lot of experts installing this kind of technology at the moment, and people are kind of learning as they go, and they're trying to build up, you know, a good solid supply chain like we have with gas boilers. You know, so many people know perfectly how to fit gas boilers. And so I think it is really important that we talk about the problems with these technologies that people have in order to learn. But at the same time, we have to talk about it in a way that doesn't put everyone off the technology and feel like it's the technology's problem, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Lucy. And Joseph, I definitely think I'd want to kind of come back and talk to you about that example again this week, and we could perhaps, you know, try and weave that in at some way later on into other sessions, because I think that's really interesting. And I know, you know, Sandy's picked up on it as well, being from, you're from Blackpool, aren't you, Sandy? So again, it's an interesting how that coastal communities might pick up on that. Really, really interesting one. Can I just go to a point that Keith has put in the chat? I mean, you're saying the panels used, but at least, Lucy, what is your view on the reported fact that air source heat pumps cannot meet the need of lower temperatures, and potential additional heating is going to be needed by the resident? Again, are you picking up anything about that? People starting to say already it won't meet the needs, as people need something else?
Yeah, so that's actually something that I picked up, you know, just like last week, preparing this presentation, because yeah, the kind of overhead fact that I put in my presentation is that they should be able to pick up heat from temperatures as low as -15 degrees. But yeah, there are people saying that this isn't possible and that it's not working right now. And I think ground source heat pumps are generally thought to be a little bit better, but they are more expensive, and you need that kind of garden space, like I said. So there are positives and negatives to both. But I think it again comes back to this technology isn't going to be perfect right now, but we kind of have to crack on with it and have to talk openly about the challenges, because that's how we like learn and develop the technology. But at the same time, I think, you know, if you're in a home that is one of these kind of early ones that is kind of landlords are trialing out this technology, it may not always be smooth the whole time. And I think, yeah, we just need to be honest about that.
Yeah, absolutely. But real concern, I think, for residents, isn't it? Certainly those residents that are kind of going first on this, is a real concern about, well, what's in their homes and can it be supported? And I'm sure that'll come out as the rest of the week. Let's do a couple of quick last ones before we need to start to draw to a close. Just before I do, though, for the session tomorrow around demystifying the tech, we've got Stephen, who's CEO of Heat Trust, who support heat networks. So if any of you are particularly interested in that, that may be a session worth joining tomorrow to sort of carry on with this question and talk about those. Where we're going to Gemma's comment in the chat, again, just to see if you've got any views, Lucy. Are there any better alternatives to the current energy rating system being used? Are you hearing anyone talking about anything better out there?
So I will say that I am not an expert on this system at all. And all that I know is that there is a lot of debate around the ways that we measure. And there are definitely talks of changing SAP and EPC. I don't know in detail kind of what these different measurements are and how they work, but I know it's definitely something that people are talking about. But for the moment, it's good to understand SAP and EPC, because that's what the government's using, and that is what social landlords are using.
Yeah, it's well known, isn't it, at least, and there's some kind of advantage to that, isn't there, that everybody kind of understands it. There's often an advantage in that, absolutely. And there's lots of other questions, and I suspect these are going to get picked up in the CEO session. So next, around kind of, you know, issues around conservation, you know, complex buildings, all of these kind of things. We'll try and pick those up. Just a final comment, really. Someone's just mentioned around, you know, social housing is doing this, but what are you picking up about the challenge for the private rented sector? I know we're focused on social housing, but what do you think the big challenges there are?
I mean, it's just a massive challenge that I think no one has really cracked. The social housing sector in a lot of ways is kind of going first on this. And because there are massive benefits to starting with the social housing sector, you know, landlords own huge numbers of homes, and also doing this work, which is something I didn't really dive into too much in my presentation. I'm sure CEOs will talk about it, does have a massive potential for people to reduce your heating bills and to have a more comfortable home. So there are kind of social housing's the easiest place to start. I don't think anyone has really figured out how they're going to push private landlords to do this work, because clearly they're not incentivized in the way social landlords are. There's going to probably have to be some kind of carrot stick approach, but I don't think anyone's really cracked what that's going to be yet.
No, I think you're absolutely right. It's a whole other debate, some of which may get touched on the What's the Politics session on Wednesday. And just because I need to draw this to a close, I'm afraid, I noticed in the chat there's also been some mention around damp and mould. So can I draw people's attention to, on Friday, we're running a session called Healthy Homes, where we will have Lucy from Decent Homes on that panel from MHCLG. I know it's changed now, but I haven't got it in the head yet. Talking about Decent Homes review, but also Ben Meredith will be there from the Housing Ombudsman, starting to talk about some of the deep dive work they've done about damp and mould in particular, and some of the complaints they're seeing from the Ombudsman. So if you know, I think that's such a massive issue. Please try and come along to that session on Friday as well. Okay, I'm going to draw us to a close. I'd like to say a huge thank you to you, Lucy. That was a really informative romp through to get us going on the week, and many of the issues that you've raised will be talked about through the course of the week. I will take all the questions that's in that chat, rest assured, and we will make sure that we deal with those as the week unfolds. Thank you, everybody that's attended this morning. Please do drop Lisa a line if you want to attend the next session, which is starting at 11 o'clock. But for now, thank you, everybody, and goodbye.
Thank you.